Ever heard of digital kidnapping? It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, right? But it's a real thing. Someone taking your child's photo and building this whole fake life around it online.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the creepier things about the internet these days.
So we're diving into all that today. Digital kidnapping, child safety online, especially here in Trinidad and Tobago. We've got these articles from technewstt, Trinidad and Tobago Newsday, and the Trinidad Guardian. Lots to unpack.
Right. And it's important to be clear about what digital kidnapping actually is. It's not like someone pretending to be your kid online. It's not like classic catfishing,
Okay, so not impersonation.
It's more like fabrication. They're taking a photo and inventing a whole new identity.
So instead of tricking people into thinking they are your child, it's about making up this whole other life for them online. But why? What's the point of that?
Well, sometimes it's attention-seeking, plain and simple. Wanting that validation, those likes, even if it's based on something, well, kind of messed up.
Right, like some kind of fantasy.
Exactly. It can get really disturbing. And then there's the control thing, crafting this whole narrative, playing it out online like it's some kind of game.
I've even heard it called role-playing. Is that what we're talking about here?
Yeah, some people try to pass it off as harmless role-playing, but that actually makes it even sneakier, even more dangerous,
What does that even look like?
Well, on platforms like Instagram, you'll see these hashtags, things like #AdoptionRP or #KidRP. It's all about elaborate fantasies, often centered around, orphans or abandoned children.
And that's where it gets really worrying.
Right. Those hashtags can attract some really bad actors, people with, let's just say, less than innocent intentions.
Definitely something parents should be aware of. The technewstt article mentioned an Instagram account, @KidsForPrivacy, that highlights some of these hashtags parents should watch out for. It makes you think, is all this oversharing on social media, all this sharenting, part of the problem?
It's definitely a big part of it, yeah. I think sometimes parents don't fully realize the risks of constantly posting photos of their kids online. They don't think about the fact that the child has no control over it,
It's true. It's not like kids are giving their permission for every single photo.
And then there's the potential for misuse by anyone, really, anyone who can access those photos.
And it's not like you can just take it back once it's out there. The internet never forgets, right? That digital footprint can last a lifetime. And these kids had no say in creating it. But before we get into the whole child online protection thing, when we talk about the consequences of this digital kidnapping, I'm assuming it's not always just harmless fantasy.
No, absolutely not. We don't want to get into graphic details.
Yeah.
But there have been cases where these made-up identities, they're used to create and share child sexual abuse material.
That's horrifying.
It is. And the worst part is these images, they can be taken, they can be manipulated, shared without the child ever knowing, without their consent. It leaves them so incredibly vulnerable to exploitation.
It's terrifying to think about that kind of exploitation. Makes the whole issue of child online protection feel even more urgent,
Yeah. For sure. And we have to remember, digital kidnapping is just one piece of this whole puzzle. There's so much more to talk about when it comes to online threats facing kids.
Right. So when we talk about child online protection, or COP, what are we actually talking about?
So COP, it's this global effort, right, to tackle all kinds of child exploitation online. We're talking about everything from cyberbullying to, the stuff we just discussed, like child sexual abuse material.
And even things like kids seeing stuff they shouldn't. Right.
Yeah.
Inappropriate content, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It's a huge problem, and it requires a multi-pronged approach.
So where does Trinidad and Tobago fit into all of this? We're looking at these articles, and it feels like a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag, honestly. The good news is that Trinidad and Tobago has actually taken some positive steps. Like the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU, they have these guidelines for countries to follow.
Okay, so there's a kind of international standard.
Right, and Trinidad and Tobago were actually meeting those requirements in a few key areas.
Well, that's encouraging, at least. So what are we doing right? Give me the good news first.
So for one thing, we have legislation in place, the Children's Act of 2012, that directly addresses child protection, both online and offline.
Okay, so there are laws, that's a start.
And there's some institutional support as well. There's the eConnect and Learn program, for example.
I've heard of that, yeah.
And there are elements within the National School Code of Conduct that aim to create a safer online environment.
Sounds like there's a framework there, at least. But realistically, are there actually enough resources dedicated to putting these protections in place?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there are gaps for sure. This stuff changes so fast online, it's hard to keep up.
And it's not like technology waits for anyone.
Exactly. A 2017 report by the Commonwealth Internet Governance Forum highlighted some of these gaps.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? What needs more focus?
Well, one thing is the kind of content kids might be exposed to. Even if it's not technically illegal, it can still be harmful.
Right, like what are we talking about specifically?
Think about those manipulative online games, the ones that prey on kids with deceptive advertising.
Oh yeah, those are sneaky.
Or exposure to violent extremism, self-harm websites, stuff like that.
It's scary how easy it is for kids to stumble across that stuff online.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole cyberbullying issue. We know how devastating that can be.
The Trinidad Guardian article mentions some debate about cyberbullying laws here. What's the latest on that?
It's complicated. There's been a lot of talk about freedom of expression, for publishers, broadcasters, that sort of thing.
So how do you balance freedom of speech with protecting kids online?
That's the big question, isn't it? And unfortunately, the focus on child protection within those laws hasn't really been front and center.
It's a tough one, for sure. But even when there is a plan, actually making it happen is another thing.
Exactly. And the technewstt article had a really good example of this. Remember Shiva Bisasar?
Vaguely, yeah. Refresh my memory.
She developed this amazing cyber awareness program.
That's promising. What happened?
It was designed to be used in all secondary schools across Trinidad and Tobago.
Wow, that's ambitious.
It could be a real difference, but, lack of funding, it never got implemented.
Seriously?
Yeah, it's a classic case of a great idea that just didn't get the support it needed.
It's so frustrating, It feels like this happens all the time. And sadly, we see what can happen when things fall through the cracks, like with the tragic case of Jaden Lelchan. It's just heartbreaking, A young life lost.
Really highlights the real-world consequences of this, yeah.
The Trinidad and Tobago Newsday article went into some detail about the parliamentary debate that happened after he died.
Yeah, it got pretty heated, right?
So what were the main points being raised?
Well, you had Mr. Morris Julian basically defending the Ministry of Education's stance. They were emphasizing the whole zero-tolerance policy on bullying.
Right, because that was already in place, wasn't it?
Exactly. And they were pointing to these existing systems, the disciplinary measures that schools are supposed to have.
But is that enough? I mean, clearly something went wrong in Jaden's case.
That's the question a lot of people were asking, yeah. Did the policy fail him, or was it just not implemented properly?
Because a policy on paper doesn't mean much if it's not actually protecting kids in the real world.
Exactly. And then you had MP Patarath on the other side.
And they were arguing.
They were saying the system failed Jaden, point blank. They talked about budget cuts to the Children's Authority, lack of resources, basically saying there's not enough actual commitment to tackling the root causes of bullying.
It's like this gap between what's supposed to happen and what's actually happening on the ground,
Yeah, and that's what makes these cases so tragic.
So where do we even go from here? What can we actually do to make things better?
Well, the technewstt article had some good advice for parents.
Like what?
Practical stuff, like really understanding the privacy settings on social media.
Yeah, because who actually reads all those terms and conditions, right?
Most people don't, but they're there for a reason. Like limiting who can actually see photos of your kids. That's a big one.
It's true. Not everyone needs to be tagged in every single thing you post.
Right, and then there's geotagging.
Geotag?
It's when your location is embedded in the photos you take.
Yep.
Turn that off. That's a smart move if you're concerned about privacy.
I'll admit, I never even thought about that.
It's amazing how much information we just give away online without realizing it.
It really is.
Oh, and getting consent before posting photos of kids, that's huge.
That's just basic respect, right?
Exactly. Even if they're young, teaching them about digital consent, it's never too early.
It's about giving them some control over their own digital footprint, right?
Absolutely.
But this isn't just about what parents can do, is it?
Nope. It's a collective effort, for sure.
What needs to happen on a larger scale?
Well, we need way more awareness about all these issues, for one.
Education, right? For kids, for parents, for teachers.
Exactly. Trinidad and Tobago needs more programs like the one Shiva Bisasar created, remember?
The cyber awareness program, right?
Yeah, that one. It's about equipping kids with the knowledge and skills to actually navigate the digital world safely.
And that takes resources, doesn't it?
It does.
It takes commitment from the government, from industry leaders.
And let's not forget support for victims of cyberbullying. That's crucial.
Absolutely, because it's not enough to just tell kids to speak up. We need to make sure there's someone there to listen, right?
Exactly. And thankfully, there are resources available.
Important to remember that there is help out there, but it sounds like we've still got a long way to go when it comes to truly protecting kids online.
Yeah, it's a constant battle, especially with technology evolving so quickly.
It's like trying to hit a moving target sometimes.
Exactly. But the more we talk about these issues, the more aware we become. The better equipped we'll be to create a safer, more responsible online experience for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for diving into this with me. It's been, well, eye-opening to say the least.
Anytime. Glad we could shed some light on all this.
And to everyone listening, remember, the online world is constantly changing. So what steps can you take today to make it a safer, more positive space for yourself and for the children in your life? Think about it.